I'm a game designer from Melbourne, Australia, and I grew up playing L's games. This is Lowe. Worked at Sierra from the very early days, so I'm hoping to have a little chat about the days at Sierra, particularly around King's Quest 3. For some reason, that like ended up being a special game for me. But I want to relate it a bit to your later work on Leisure Suit Larry that you're famous for, and stuff that came a bit beforehand. So welcome and thanks for taking the time to chat.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
Nice.
Wait, where are we?
Yeah, you're most famous, I guess, over these many years of your career for working on Leisure Suit Larry, which was a great series, and I played those, of course. But yeah, but I was born in 1978, so by the time Sierra, I guess Sierra started about 1980, and you were there, I think, by 1982. So I was probably just the perfect age to be growing up on these games and very like inspired by them. I guess I wanted to start by maybe asking you. You bought an Apple II, I guess, very early on in the industry and positioned yourself to be right there to join Sierra. Sort of, how did that happen? I guess, how did you get on board there and how get started?
I was always a geek before that term was used. I was the kid in grade school who fixed the film projector, and I was the guy in high school who set up the PA system. And I was always involved soldering stuff or doing something. And when computers came out, when I saw the Apple II, I just thought this sounds like the ultimate gadget. I need one of these. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but somehow I got to make it pay for itself. So I convinced my wife that she and I would use it in our work, um, which she didn't very much, but I did, and ended up teaching myself how to program. When our son became 3 or 4 years old, he went away to nursery school, and 2 weeks later came home with chicken pox. And 2 weeks after that, I had chicken pox. And suddenly, I um, I was sick as a dog, and there wasn't any place on my body that you could touch that wasn't a pock. And that's when I grew a beard because I couldn't shave. I've had it ever
Right.
since. What it meant was I had plenty of time at home under quarantine to learn something new, do something different. And since there was no TV to watch at that time, I think we had 4 channels, and I'd already read every book in the house. I ended up with a deck programming manual for Deck Basic, and I got an account number and a password, and pretty much taught myself how to program in Basic. I had a friend who knew a little more than I did, and he helped me through some rough spots. But mostly, I was just self-taught. I read things out of books and magazines. Magazines were just beginning at that time, and I ended up writing some software that we used in our work, and eventually ended up selling commercially. Then our son was old enough to start to read, and we thought, well, we should. Why don't we write a game for him that encourages him to read, but that's also fun to play. And at that time, educational software was very educational, and it was not games. There was no gaming involved. Well, he and I had been playing adventure games, particularly from Sierra and Roberta Williams, ever since I bought the computer. So I thought, well, I'll make an adventure game that's simple enough for him to play and he could read on his own, and something simple that I can program. I bought the first graphics program commercially available for the Apple II from a guy named Mark Pelzarski in Illinois, another school teacher, who started a company called Penguin Software, and he helped me get the program going. And I created educational games, and we invested a lot of money for us to buy a booth at a computer using educators show, um, and the games were received quite well. So that gave us courage to go to Apple Fest, which went quite well. And at Apple Fest, every publisher in the industry was there, and they all said, "You don't want to be a publisher. You want to be a developer. You want to create stuff. You don't want to box games and wait for the UPS truck to show up," which was exactly the way we felt at that point. Did
Where
it
were you
selling
living at
ourselves?
that point?
Um, Fresno, California.
Okay, so you were pretty near where you could go to like the Apple Fests and things like this. You were sort of in that.
Yeah, we were 3 hours from San Francisco and
Okay.
4 hours from Los Angeles.
Was the Apple II the first computer, or did you have a DEC computer? Is that a different computer?
Well, DEC was a Digital Equipment Corporation. They created mini computers.
'Cause was that like the PDPs and stuff?
I started on a PDP 1170.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yep, good
So
call.
did you own that computer? That was a
Oh,
home
hell
computer?
no. No, that was
Because I
owned
thought
by
that
the
was at
school.
universities and things or something.
Yes, the school district owned one, and they used for accounting and purchasing and business things, but not even word processing. They didn't own a word processor. It was just strictly accounting and numbers.
So would you be
Um,
learning that like in your off time in some room at the school or something, or?
I learned it in my off time when I was sick at home with chickenpox.
So how
They
did you have it at home?
No, it was a huge machine that took up a whole air conditioned room with a fake false floor, and there
Wow.
were servants bowing before it every day, and the priesthood of the programmers back there. I mean, it was one of those
Wow.
typical uh, uh, gigantic machines. Well, it had a disk drive. Uh,
Right.
and I think the disk drive had 10 14-inch platters. They would lift out this thing that looked like a cake tin,
Right.
and that had 10, and it held, like 20
Kilobytes or
megabytes,
something.
or
Yeah,
some
right.
immense amount of data on it at a time. So, hey, no, they loaned me a terminal when they found out I was interested in writing software.
So were you
They loaned me a
effectively
terminal.
on a sort of a network, were you? You were
They loaned me a terminal and a dial-up modem. And
okay.
the dial-up modem consisted of, I would dial my phone like with this kind of thing. It wasn't even a push button phone, right?
Yeah.
Dial this phone and then take the earpiece and stick it in these two suction cups that were on the desk, and it talked at 110 baud,
So
not
you,
110 megabits,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
not
remember
110 kilobits,
I don't know.
110 bits a second.
Right,
You could
bits.
type as fast as the damn thing
Yeah.
trans.
I remember in
But
Weird Science they have that thing where they're inventing the girl and they've got one of those modems with the anyway.
with rubber suction cups.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. So that's how I started, and then 2 years after that, the Apple II came out.
you can see why
Amazing.
people were so excited by the Apple II, like what a
Well,
world
yeah,
of
I
difference.
looked at that, and our school district had a let's see, how can I say it? There was a company who was just getting started in the business of promoting computers into businesses. They chose to go with processor technology. Have you heard of that computer company?
No.
No, because they went out of business like a year after they opened.
Right.
So this poor guy owned a bunch of those machines. What's he going to do with them? He donated them to the school district so he could take a tax write-off.
The
I mean, these were
PDPs.
worthless, absolutely worthless machines. They were no longer supported. But I saw them come in to the purchasing office, and I said, or to the surplus office, and I said, "Who's going to use those?" And well, I'll take one. I'll try one and see if I can make it work. And so I took it home and tried to make it work. It didn't have any RAM. I
Right.
called the guy up and said, I don't get it. How's this thing work? And he said, oh, well, it doesn't have any memory. You'd have to buy a memory card. I went, buy a memory card? Well, how much is a memory card? And he said, 4K for $200.
Yeah, and $200 was probably $1,500 now or something, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. So that's how old I am. That's how I got my start in the computer business.
So you never ended up using that one, I don't suppose.
No, not really.
Yeah. So you got the Apple II, and things really took off from there.
And the
by the
rest was
sound of it.
history.
Yeah.
It's been nice talking with you.
That's High Res Adventures covered. So you were playing the High Res Adventure games, and then you
I
made.
did.
It sounds like Dragon's Keep and
Troll's Tale.
Troll's Tale and Dragon's Keep. Dragon's Keep came first, did it?
Yes.
So Dragon's Keep and Troll's Tale were done what with this Penguin Software graphics thing, but sort of
As was the cult classic Boppa Bet.
I saw Bopper Bet mentioned, and I don't
Yeah.
know what that one is.
Well, for you game collectors out there, if you can get a copy of Boppa Bet, you've got a real unicorn on your hands. I think we made 200 copies to start with.
Right.
Put them in Ziploc plastic bags and sold them. And then Sierra bought the company and the rights to the game. They put out a few thousand of them, but it didn't sell well, and it wasn't a very good game. But man, is it a collector's item today? I don't know what the going price is on a Boppa Bet, but it's got to be way up there.
Was Dragon's Keep your very first game you wrote?
Yes.
Where did and Bopper Bet was in the middle somewhere there?
It was second, and then Troll's Tale was third.
Cool. It's interesting to sort of see.
And all this,
Go on.
all this information is readily available online at allo.com.
I had a good look at llow.com, and there's a great mixture of stuff from computer history to inside tales of this stuff, and as well as comedy stuff as well. Back to what you said near the start, you were talking about when you were growing up, you were a very technical person. You were into projectors and soldering and electronics and stuff, but also reading and stuff. What kind of things, I guess, were you into in terms of books or comics or movies? Like, what was sort of any standout things that inspired you along the way?
Well, I was very much into comedy all my life. I was always interested in that. But in grade school, we didn't have a school library. We were kind of a small country school. And we instead had a bookmobile that came from the county. And one day a week, she would drive in and park this big kind of RV thing with books in the back. And we would check out books from that. And at one point, I got into the bookmobile and said, "Do you have any other science fiction books? Because I've read every one of these." And so you could say I was into science fiction.
So is that like fantasy and sci-fi, anything, or in particular?
Just all that stuff. I was a big Heinlein fan. I read a lot of Robert Heinlein. But also adventure books, story books, detective stories, a lot. I read a lot, and I wasn't very good at sports. I don't know if you can tell from my body, but I was never built for basketball or anything active. But I was perfect to sit behind a keyboard. And my sister did a very smart thing. She was years older than me, but she insisted that I learn to touch type at a young age. And so when I got onto computers and things, it was second nature to me. I'm a pretty fast typist and always have been.
To jump ahead a bit, I guess more towards the King's Quest era, well, maybe to grab a few little insights about when you were starting up at Sierra. It sounds like you did the high-res adventures, so I guess like Roberta Williams is sort of, I guess, the most known for the high-res adventures, but obviously different people wrote those. And she's more known for the King's Quest stuff too, but I'm interested in how the two of you kind of started working together on things like the Dark Crystal Gelfling adventure and later on King's Quest 3 in particular, I guess. But Black Cauldron's sort of hiding away in the middle there too, which I think there's not a lot of discussion necessarily about the King's Quest 3 and the Black Cauldron games. It seems like that game took quite a while to make, and that maybe you even started it around the time King's Quest 1 was getting finished off, and it supposedly, reading about it, it covered a bit of AGI's history over a few versions and took a while to get made. Was that a complex development from working with Disney perhaps, or like did it take longer than a lot of the other games? What was the sort of story around that? Because you're the sort of the name title on that game, so was that very much your project sort of from start to finish?
Yes, it was my project. Disney saw the games, the educational software that I had done for Sierra, and they said, "We have a new movie coming out. We'd like you to do a game based on that film." And that was the last film before Michael Eisner came on board. So it was still Roy Disney and the remains of the early year Disney employees. So I literally went to Hollywood and went to the Burbank to the Disney lot. So looked through all the original watercolor drawings for the game, for the movie, and much of the animation. Elmer Bernstein's originals handwritten score for the music for the game, for the movie, and I had my choice of what I wanted to use in the game. So I took some of the backgrounds and we took the characters that Disney had created. I took the score, and we ended up using as much of it as we could in the game. Black Cauldron was the first game that Disney did that Sierra did in AGI that was not a typing game. It was later on we called it icon driven, where you would click on an icon and that would choose your action or your noun or what it was you were looking at. In the Black Cauldron, you were limited to moving around on the screen and then several function keys. Because it was written for the PC Junior specifically and for PCs that had EGA cards, it wasn't exactly a business machine kind of game, but it was right at the beginning of the expansion of the IBM clones, and once they started coming out, the sales of the game really soared. The development time was not very long for a game of its complexity, and my approach was to keep it as far away from Disney people as possible until it was done, because I saw what they did with some of the other Disney titles at Sierra, and they seemed to slow things down. So I just thought, well, I'll just work here at home and stay away from the office, and nobody will see things, and I'll just get everything done and then show it to them. So that's kind of the way it went.
Yep.
The company went through some hard times, and I must tell you, there's a guy named Sean Mills who's written a book about the Sierra Adventure, and I think that's the name of the website, actually, thesierraadventure.com. And it's a wonderful book on the history of Sierra, if you're interested at all. And in fact, if you've stayed around listening to this far, you should go buy the book, because he's gone into great depth, done a lot of great research, and hell, I learned things reading the book. So I'd recommend it if you want real detail on any of these kinds of things.
I'm keen to check that out too.
Yeah, but the development time was not longer. It was just a large project, and it took us quite a while to accomplish.
It was basically what King's Quest 1, and obviously that's got a bunch of story about IBM wanting to promote the IBM Junior, and I guess at that time Sierra built Adventure Game Interpreter, or the AGI system, and then King's Quest 2, and then the Black Cauldron. Is that pretty much the order there of development?
That seems about right. You're being far too kind when you say they built the AGI system.
I wanted
What
to know a
happened
bit more
was,
about this. Yeah.
well, I mean, it was much more crude, more rough-hewn than that. The guys developed the system for King's Quest 1 when they were, and Ken made a brilliant decision, which was to ask IBM, hey, if you're not going to do other games with this engine, can we keep it? And they said, sure. We don't want a game engine.
Yep.
And so, in spite of the fact that IBM paid for the development of the system, Ken got to keep it and use it in other games.
It's
and
pretty funny to think that was a bit of an offhand thing for IBM, because for Sierra, I think it was the advantage.
IBM, that this is like sofa cushion change, for them. That was
It's funny because that's really what set Sierra apart from, like, I guess Infocom had done that interpreter approach where they could make a lot of content with the one kind of basic engine, and Sierra very much did the same thing with the same sort of benefit, I think.
Yeah, except that they didn't do any of the hard stuff.
They didn't have the actual stage and scenes and characters, and
all they had was text. It was text and a parser.
Yeah.
And we did all that, plus graphics and animation, and we faked 3D All that stuff was incredible at the time. I
Yeah.
remember the first time I saw King's Quest, it just blew me away. I couldn't imagine how it was possible to do that without custom graphics for everything. I
What
mean,
was it
you
like for
gotta
you?
understand, in the early days, in order to make something go behind something else, you had to have a special cell of animation here that cut off this part, because there is no depth of plane. It's
Yeah.
just it's all 2D. So how would you make something go behind something else on a 2D plane? Well, what Sierra did was figure out that there were bands of depth, like curtains on a stage,
Yeah.
and if you were above a certain y coordinate, well, you were behind the thing that had a higher y coordinate, and so forth. The book goes into much better detail on that than I could. But the important thing was, when King's Quest was done, they had a bunch of these, a collection of all these different things that worked, and they turned that into a system. And it was very crude. I mean, you only had a few functions. There was no documentation. You had to learn from someone else who held your hand and said, here's what you do: take some code from here and steal this from there, and then change it a little bit and see if you can make it work. And that's the way we learned how to program in the language. And then as the years passed, Jeff Stevenson added more and more features to that engine, and so it became more flexible and more capable. But when we started, man, it was like writing with bear skins and stone knives, or something.
Yeah. So did Jeff Steven? It's often credited to Jeff Stevenson, Chris Iden, and Bob Heitman. I think the sort of the
Well,
system.
Jeff was the principal on. Bob Heitman came along later. He developed a lot of the tools that we use. People have to understand, this was years before there was a Photoshop.
I
You,
wanted
you
to
tell
ask,
people,
like, were you on a 286 and you'd sort of boot up some tools, or what were you? How did
there
you
were no
work on?
tools. You didn't boot up tools. You booted up DOS. You had DOS. What are you gonna? There was no way to draw anything on the screen. The guys at Sierra created an editor that let them draw things on the screen. They created another editor that allowed them to take cells of animation and loop them. I mean, all that stuff had to be done by hand. There was no assistance, you know. So Photoshop didn't come along until after Larry 2, I think,
Right.
somewhere around that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you tell people today, oh yeah, we made a game before Photoshop, and it's like, what? How can that? That's not possible.
Yeah. That's great. Cool. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I also was curious about your take. Maybe this is a good time to jump into it. You did the Black Cauldron, and I guess you wanted it to be more accessible, maybe to a younger audience. I'm not sure exactly why. Get away from the text parser and going to. I think I've actually got the keys written here. F3 for choose an inventory item, F4 to use an inventory item, F6 to just use or interact with something near the player, I think, and F8 to look. That was really interesting, and as you said, this was what, 1985 or 1986, and before, effectively, I guess that's point and click, but where
It
you
came
press
out in
buttons.
1984, as I recall. You could go to allo.com. There's a
There.
list of all my games and the shipping dates on them. So
What have we got here? Here it is. Oh, it does say 84. Okay, so that's earlier than I was
Moby
thinking.
is wrong.
And 1985 for King's Quest 3, not 1986, which I've been looking at.
Yeah,
So that's good to know.
that sounds right. Yeah,
So
somewhere in there, I think after Black Cauldron, I did an educational game called Donald Duck's Playground
yep.
that won several awards for best educational title of, I think, 85. I think that's right. And then after that, we gave Ken gave back the license to Disney because it turned out that the licensing deal was great for Disney because we did all the work and they took a big cut of the money. And at that time, licensed characters weren't selling better than our original characters were. Our game sold as well with or without Disney characters in them, and so why give Disney all the money? So he gave up the Disney titles, and when he did, I was looking for something to do, and we both remembered that back in the very early days, Ken had published a game called Soft Porn, and it was a huge hit at the time. So he said, well, why don't we bring that up to date? And I think this was end of 1986, maybe. And bring it up to date and use the new AGI interpreter and so forth and see if maybe we can do that. I said, okay. But I took it home and played the game, and God, it was 5, 6, maybe 7 years old at that time. And it was so out of date. It was just terrible. And I took it back to him and I said, Ken, there's no way I can do a version of this game that'll be any good. I mean, it's so out of date, it should be wearing a leisure suit. And I got a laugh. Nice. And I thought, oh, leisure suits must be funny. So I said, the only way if you want me to do it, I think the only way I could do it is if you'd let me make fun of the game and instead of just doing a straight port. And he said, oh, that'd be great. Sure, make it funny. So I didn't know what I was signing up for. I'd never written a funny game. I didn't. In fact, I'd only seen a couple of games that purported to be funny. Steve Maretsky's Leather Goddesses of Phobos was one of those, but it was text only. And so I did my best to make Larry and make it funny. But that I'm ahead of myself. You want to talk about King's Quest 3 and that?
Yeah, so, I am interested in some threads there as well. Like I saw that you were lead programmer or one of the main programmers on King's Quest. On Police Quest 1 as well, which must have predated Larry by one game, probably.
No.
No. It was after, was it?
After.
Okay, because there's some. I was just watching a quick video of Police Quest 1, and there is some funny comedy in there as well, and I sort of wondered, it partly is relating to King's Quest 3 as well, but when you were working on a game, would you be, like, even if you weren't the person who was credited, like Jim Walls as designer or Roberta Williams, were you still filling in little gaps and typing in responses to certain things and stuff like that along the way?
Me?
I kind of figure that that would the programmer would just be doing that all over the place.
Why? What would make you think that?
There's little comedy bits in the locker room and stuff at the start of Police Quest.
You gotta understand when Jim was hired to write a game, he knew as much about game writing as any of us did when we started. Nobody knew anything about how to write a game. There were no classes you could take. There were no books you could read. There were no magazine articles on how to design a game, particularly an adventure game. All of us just played games, and we kind of thought, oh, I could do that. I can do something like that. And that's what we did. Jim didn't even play games, but he was a great storyteller.
Right.
Still is. And he convinced Ken, and Ken convinced him to a certain extent that he could tell this story through video games. So when I finished Larry, it was the worst, Larry 1. It was the worst selling game in the history of the company. I figured, oh God, I've just wasted 6 months of my life, because I didn't get paid salary. I didn't get paid advances. I was betting that on the sales of the game. So I had gotten no money. I'd shipped the product and it went out and was terrible. So when they said, hey, Al, can you help out on Police Quest 1? They're having trouble. I said, sure. And so I dove right into Police Quest 1 along with Jim and Greg Rowland. And we literally lived together in a house in Oakhurst. We each had a bedroom, and then we'd sit together in the family room and code all night, all day and all.
Right.
And we'd code till we couldn't stay awake anymore. We'd lay down and sleep for a while, get up and code again. And when I got to the game, it was a story. it was Jim's story of what you could do to complete the game. But there was no other information in it. In other words, there were no alternatives. There was no help. There was no hints of anything you could do. There were no actions that weren't at the point in the script that they were supposed to be. So
it was just
like
the
a
golden
movie.
path, like a movie. Yeah.
A golden path. That's the perfect phrase. Yes, there was a golden path, and if you didn't know the exact phrase to type, you got an answer that was, "You're blowing it."
Right. Right.
And I can't tell you how many thousand times I saw, "You're blowing it." And
Right.
I go, "What the hell, Jim? What does that mean? Why how am I blowing it? What am I doing wrong?" So he had to write hundreds of responses to all those places where there were no clues and hints and so forth in the game. So we fleshed it out a lot, and in doing so, became friends and had a great time together. But it was a lot of writing on the fly and development on the fly because of his inexperience and also his lack of knowledge as a game designer. So
Yeah. Interesting.
but he grew over the years too, just like the rest of us.
Yeah, I remember playing Codeman Iceman later too, which I believe was one of his other
It was his.
avenues. So did you live near there in general? Like you're talking about living in Oakhurst in a sort of a share house at that point.
Yeah, I
for
was
that time.
living. My wife and I and children lived in Fresno, and I would work. I worked at home. Fresno's about 45 minutes away from Oakhurst, and so I would go up periodically for meetings or, uh, uh, you know, consultation or whatever, or design things. But for the most part, I worked at home and not there. I didn't have an office at Sierra. I wasn't an employee of Sierra. I was an outside contractor that, uh, and I worked that way for 15 years.
Yeah, I did hear an interview where you were saying you were only an employee for about 1 year, and then it turned into more of this
6 months. I
royalty
got fired
system.
for 6 months.
Sounds like it
Best
worked out
thing that
well
ever
for you.
happened. Best thing that ever happened.
Yeah. All right. That's awesome. We're jumping around a bit, but that's good. So I guess I wanted to get onto the King's Quest 3 thing. So when you were doing the Black Cauldron, I think Roberta Williams is credited in there somewhere too. Was she sort of just someone that you would be bouncing ideas off for, like, how do we get the design sorted out, or what's the? I'm sort of wondering a bit like what was the relationship between you two as designers and your programming and designing as well, and then King's Quest 3 was, I guess, more led by her, but you programming. So I'm interested, sort of, I guess, in that design relationship and how that changed over those years, those early years, I guess.
I designed Black Cauldron. I wrote all the text in the game, and I came up with all the characters and the situations and everything. Roberta consulted with me a couple times here and there on problems. When I'd have a problem or a thought about something, or what would you do here, or how would you do this, she was more than happy to help out. And part of that was because we were working in her home. The company was on hard times and had really shrunken down to a small handful of people at that point. And Mark Crow and Scott Murphy and Ken and I, and I'm trying to think of who else, all went to Ken's house, and we worked out of his office in his home for months, a lot of months. I can't remember how many, but
Right. Interesting.
so she was more of a consultant, but somehow her name ended up on the box.
Maybe to help, by that time she was a name, I guess. So.
Oh, of course. You kidding? With her name on the box, it sold much better.
Yep.
But then the situation was reversed. We did work together like that, but when it came time for King's Quest 3, I think Ken was happy with the way I took the lead on Black Cauldron, and Roberta was looking for someone that she could trust to bring King's Quest 3 out. And so there, she gave me a huge document that said, here's all the stuff that happens in the game. And if this doesn't happen, this happens. And if they do this, this happens. But if they don't, this other thing. And, but it was all text. It was all written in the form of a gigantic text
Would she also have a
document,
big
hundreds of pages.
map or something?
And, oh yeah, sure, on a map. And she had pictures of the characters, and she gave, she discussed those with the people doing the animation, and she discussed each background scene with the artist who drew those, and it was a very interactive process. So on that game, she was working every day with the artists and the programmers and the musicians and everybody to bring that game together. It was King's Quest 3 was a big project. She bit off a lot more than she had in any previous game. And Bob Heitman and I got an office together, and we became very close. I mean, we worked round the clock. Again, it was another one of those round the clock things, but I spent a whole lot of time away from my family in order to get that game out in time for Christmas. So.
I feel as though that game really, like you say, she bit off a big challenge there. Like I feel like there was King's Quest 1 and 2, which were sort of a mishmash of fairy tales, and it was an exciting open world sort of experience. Like you say, when you first saw it, it was like, wow, I can walk anywhere, and you're sort of exploring. But I feel like the Black Cauldron almost set the sort of new standard for like, let's tell a more cohesive story here. And you'd sort of proven out, I think, that you could do a richer set of characters and stories and an arc. And then it was almost like King's Quest 3, maybe she was like watching and seeing what you were doing, and these ideas for King's Quest 3 almost were expanding and riffing off that, like with the whole level of complexity that would have been hard to program, I assume, too.
Everyone in the business was trying to top themselves and everyone else. It was very competitive, and the industry was growing rapidly. Computers were growing rapidly. Graphics capabilities were growing fast, and so there was the 80s were a real time of change, and it's not for nothing that the games improved over those years. People really worked hard to do that. Now, that said, there were plenty of games that came out in those times that stunk, but you don't hear about them anymore. There are no big fan base for crappy games.
Yeah, I feel like the list of Sierra games through 83 or so to 87, with all the Larry's, Police Quest, all the AGI games were just amazing, I thought. I guess partly because the artist could crank out the art quite quickly, and so I guess the designers...
That's not true. What makes you say that?
I heard that Mark Crow did all your Larry art in like 1 month, and he was working on Space Quest at the time, so...
Well, that's true. Mark was an exceptional person, but you got to understand how crude the tools were. I remember in the Black Cauldron, there was a bird-like creature called a Gwithaint. And I thought we were towards the end of the game, and it was going pretty good, and there weren't a lot of bugs. And so I was kind of bored. And I said to Mark, can you make me a Gwithaint and have, when Taran walks by, that the thing goes out and tries to grab him? And he said, yeah, sure. And so he knocked it out, in a day or half a day, probably. Yeah. And I think it was 4 cells of animation, I believe. I think that's right. And at the time, we had no way of aligning those cells of animation. We had no tool that allowed, when
like what's its center point?
Nowadays, they punch holes in the bottom of the paper they draw on, and they have onion skin paper they can look through and peel, and they draw a little here and they look at this, but it's all in alignment through registration pins that are in the paper. I'm sorry, the pins are built into the desk, and then the paper has holes in them, and that's how you do animation. Okay, so, but we hadn't invented registration pins yet. And so I spent hours moving this cell over and down and over. Down one more. Oh, maybe that'll work. And then testing it. Oops, that's not. I think the middle
like
cell's
just hand coding in for each frame.
Each cell of animation. And finally I said to somebody, can we just mark a spot and say this is the 0, 0 coordinate of that animation? And somebody said, well, yeah, that's easy. It was like nobody ever thought of it. It was just
Yeah.
okay. And then suddenly the artist could draw the animation, and everything would be in sync. And then one of my artists said, well, I'm going to make a yellow dot, because we didn't use yellow a lot, I think, or red maybe, at the origin point where the registration mark is. And then the programmer can look at that and say, oh, I'll put that at this coordinate on the screen. And it was so much simpler. And then later he'd go through and take out those dots. But that was a much simpler way
Inventing it as you go
of
along.
doing the whole thing. And then I thought of, well, what if we made a game that was an alternative to the game we were developing? So for King's Quest 3, I had a batch file called KQ3, and I would type KQ3 into DOS and it would run the game. And if I typed KQ3 82, it would take you into the game and take you directly to room 82, to scene 82, and so forth. Anything that was a parameter would take you to that part of the game. Oh, that helped a lot. And then I thought, well, what if we made another game that used all the same resources as King's Quest, but instead of it being a game, it was actually an aid to the programmer. So I made a game called Test, and Test allowed you to move things around on the screen with the arrow keys, and align animation, and to test this thing and change all
Right.
these different things. And suddenly development became much more interactive. And we had a test subdirectory. That was the name I came up with off the top of my head one quickly. Then it never changed. We had a test
Test.
subdirectory 10 years at least in every game that we developed. And I gave it to everybody at the company, and everybody used it for years. So
That's
all
cool.
that stuff was all developed in real time, and as needed on the fly.
I love it. I don't know where to fit this in, so I wanted to ask, what's your feeling about the text parser versus, say, what you experimented with in Black Cauldron versus the point and click? I guess I've heard you talk about it in an interview a bit, but just in general, I guess for the player experience, and maybe also as the designer, and how it changed your approach to thinking about like the interaction with the world or the puzzle design. Do you sort of have any thoughts on that?
The world changed when we dropped the parser. We thought we were designing games that were that had good puzzles, and were fun to figure out all the different puzzles. Well, it turned out that when we put the same amount of puzzles in a game and you could just point and click, you could finish the game much faster than when you had to type things in, because most people don't type well, they don't type fast, they don't type accurately. And a lot of people don't know how to spell. So a lot of the difficulty of playing our games turned out to be, we didn't know this at the time, but it turned out to be the dang typing. And once we got rid of typing, the flavor of the game changed, and more people could enjoy the games than ever had when it was typing interface. Now, that said, it took us one round of games, each of the designers all felt the same way. It took us a round of games before we realized, and so the first games that came out with point and click turned out to be quite easy to solve. They were easy to finish, they didn't take very long, and then the next game we learned from that, we said, oh, we just have to put in more puzzles, and because we don't have typing anymore.
Mm.
And then, at the very end of my adventure game career with Leisure Suit Larry 7, I ended up putting the text parser back in. But by then, people were so ingrained into point and click that I couldn't make the text and typing integral to the completion of the game. So it became a source of Easter eggs and just other jokes and funny things that
Right.
added features, I guess you'd say. But quite a few people, all through the years, people said, "Oh, bring back typing, bring back typing."
Yeah,
And then
for me, I always had a soft spot for it. Something about like I remember you've talked in other places about that they were sort of the graphical adventure games were sort of perfect for computers at the time because you had users in the early 80s having to fiddle with their AutoExec files and typing in DOS, and so it was natural for them to type and do archaic things with their computer, and so they enjoyed it. I think I was certainly in that group that you're talking about where learning to type, and I was probably only 8 or 9 when we started playing these games, was part of the fun, even though spelling a word like cupboard, like I remember cupboard, okay, it's cupboard. I'd be teaching myself words and typing. And I've even met people like from Poland and stuff who say they learnt to speak English by playing Space Quests and things like this. So, but I think that there was a certain open-endedness that
I've had
changed
many people tell me they learned the word prophylactic.
in Larry 1 at the drugstore. I remember that the start of Larry was hilarious because it had the age test, which was all the trivia questions, and I'd be there
Yeah.
like knowing Janis Joplin or the Rolling Stones, or like going, that's familiar, but I'm like 9, so I don't really know what that means. But you'd sort of be typing away trying to get in and learning about history, but also their jokes as well, and it was it was educational. It was definitely educational. But let's jump to King's Quest 3 because that's what I've said we're going to talk about here.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, an hour ago you asked me about that, didn't you?
yeah, I can give a little quick overview of what the game's about. But what do you recall of like what is King's Quest 3 basically about as a game?
Um,
If you're a bit hazy on it, I can jump in. But I'm curious what you remember about the setup.
well, I remember much more about the making of it and incidents that happened during it than I did the game itself. You got to understand, Bob had an area, I had an area. We've got some other people on the team, I think, and eventually who did areas, and so none of us played the game all the way through. We would uh, have an area. Um, Back then we called them rooms because this is another weird thing about this whole business was when we started doing adventure games, we didn't have vocabulary suitable for these games. Nobody knew what a scene on the screen was called, and so Ken named it a room, and for I don't know, 20 years or whatever, those were called rooms. Each of the things, whether it was outdoors in a forest or in a desert, it was still a room. And the animation, instead of being called animation or loops or so forth, those were called views. I don't know why. That's just the words we ended up using for it. So each of us had different rooms to program, and we would do our areas. But I don't think I ever played that game all the way through from beginning to end like a consumer would do, mainly because by the time you could play it from beginning to end, Ken wanted me started on another project. It was well, no, you don't have time to mess with that. Let Roberta finish it. She'll test that out. You go
Yep.
work on this. So
Cool.
yeah, it wasn't like I can really tell you, but I know that I was responsible for the ending, and I'm very proud of the fact that she had the brother and sister show up to.
Yeah, is it
Uh,
Alexander and Rosella? Although we think
yeah,
Alexander is Gwydion at the beginning.
yes. Well, he was at the beginning, but the king threw the hat, and she had the king throw the hat and have him catch the hat. And I said, Roberta, why have him catch the hat? Make it a cliffhanger. Have the hat stop in midair, and I can stop it and make it keep spinning, and then people have to play the next game to find out who catches it. That was my idea. That was one of my few contributions to the
Very
game
nice.
design.
And I
But it
remember,
turned out to be significant because ended up King's Quest 4 was Rosella's game. And so, she had Rosella catch the hat, which wasn't the plan in the original
yeah,
design.
yeah, I remember that there's been quotes of her saying that, yeah, as she sort of saw this moment, that's when she was like, "Ooh, Rosella, she could have her own story." That's great.
Yeah.
My summary of the story, I guess, would be that yeah, you start off as Gwydion, and you like even when you pick up the box, the box is this evil wizard with someone in a little bowl, trapped in a bowl, and it's unclear what the relationship even is to King's Quest 1 or 2. And even when you start playing the game, it's a story of a wizard who lives on a mountaintop, and you're there as sort of a slave to him, doing his chores, and you're like, oh, this is a bit of a non-heroic, miserable situation to be in. And he's telling you to feed the chickens or clean the kitchen, and he'll literally kill you if you haven't done it in a few minutes or something. Um, and you end up, I've got a sort of a copy of the manual here. There's the manual with all magic spells in it with full recipes that you need to go and track down these items around the world, which is quite open to explore. And Menanin, the evil wizard. I did want to ask, how do you...
But you only have so long to get there.
Yeah, I believe he will terminate you after a certain amount of time if you haven't sorted him
It was
out.
the that was the thing where Jeff Stevenson implemented timing, a seconds timer in the interpreter, and so all of us tried to figure out, well, how can we use that in a game? And Roberta thought of putting it up in the title bar and showing you just how many minutes and seconds you had left before your deadline for whatever it was you were doing was up. And that then I used that same technique later on in another game. But yeah, I thought that was really it provided a lot of tension to the player.
Yeah, Menanin would appear at some point and say, "I'm going to go away for a while. Behave yourself." And that was different than most other adventure games where they were sort of timed around just you doing something to progress.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that it sort of brought the whole world to life with this sense of this character that could sort of appear as well because he could magically teleport and appear. He could kind of appear on any screen as well, so you were constantly like thinking. I guess they talk about games all happen really in your mind, and it was that concept of you're always thinking, where's Menanin, when's he gonna come and get me, and you're collecting ingredients but hiding them under the bed so that he doesn't find them. I think part of what was so great about this game for a kid who was aged 9 or 10 at the time was, I think I only thought of this later, but it's kind of like a fable of how we think of parents or teachers or any authority figure, but ramped up to 11. Menanin's like the most horrible disciplinarian, and you're told, do this, do that, and you're like, oh, I really want to just have fun. And little Gwydion sort of figuring out a way to be free and how to find himself, and he's turning 18 or whatever. I thought that was really quite a special like fable, I suppose. I don't know whether what the developers were thinking at the time about all these things, but and I suppose Roberta was concocting a lot of the overall structure to that. I noticed as well that Margaret, your wife, did the music on that game, including the music when you're casting spells, which I thought
Yes.
was a really interesting moment, and it was very tense. I read as well, I think that Margaret did the music for Police Quest. That was also quite
Yeah, she
suspenseful
well,
and
we,
cinematic in that one.
the industry didn't have any game composers back then. And the first games were just kind of beeps and boops. And then over the years, we gradually developed into, well, there might be a theme song or some kind of music here and there. But we didn't really have any people because my background and her background was in music. We ended up doing several games for Sierra, doing the music for the games because no one else could. There was nobody else around to do it.
I saw you'd done the music for King's Quest 2 as well. Like King's Quest 1, I guess, was Greensleeves, which I actually at the time was like, this is beautiful. But then King's Quest 2, you wrote the music for that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a time of growth. I remember nobody understands. You couldn't expect people to have a sound card. You couldn't expect people to have a CD-ROM drive. You couldn't expect them to have a mouse. You know,
Yep.
it was it was a keyboard, man.
And the
You used
PC
the arrow
speaker.
keys to move around, and you type things in. It was very, very different than today.
The Magic Room, I remember being very tense, and I've heard you speak in another interview about how Roberta was insistent that when people type in these magic spells in the wizard's hidden lair that you're not even meant to be in, that you had to get it exactly right or you would fail the spell and die. And I think you said to Ken at the time, like, are we sure that we want to do it this way? It's like pretty punishing when Roberta was insistent. I thought it was great because it really made you feel like you were dealing with like life and death. You were there casting this spell. You're not meant to be there. Manannan might appear, and if you got it wrong, you would like die in some way that was probably funny, but also you had to reload and start again. And I'd often be playing it with a brother. I had a few brothers, and they'd be like maybe helping you like know what to type, and it was hard to even read what to read in the manual because it's all cursive writing. But that was really tense. Did you was that part of your responsibility at all, that magic room scene, or was that someone else?
Yeah, that was mine, and I argued with her that we should give people a certain leeway for typos, and she was uh, uh, vehement that nope, it had to be 100% perfect. I was thinking you had, I think probably some of those lines of poetry were or spells were 40, 50 characters, and I was thinking, well, I'd keep score if you typed 48 of the 50 characters right. Well, that would be good enough. But nope, she wanted 50 out of 50 or
Right.
nothing.
Yeah.
So that was easier to program.
Yeah.
It's got to be a perfect match.
Yeah. That's great. I did think.
But I think I did convert to all upper before we started. I think I ran
Right. Yeah. I don't think
a
you need
function
to
to change
capitalize.
the case and stuff. Capitals and that didn't count.
Yeah, and I don't know about the commas and stuff. But yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
you may not have to worry about the commas and things. You've mentioned that you didn't really get any feedback on these games at the time because I guess there was no message boards or internet or Twitch players or anything like this.
Hey, if
Did
you
you get a
wanted to leave
sense?
us a message about the game, you had to find a pencil and a piece of paper and an envelope and a stamp and the address to mail it to, and then in a few weeks you might get an answer back. I mean, who does that? Nobody did that.
Yeah, especially if you're in Australia, miles away, and going. Oh,
Yeah.
did you get a sense from King's Quest 3? Like, was there a bit of a sense once you'd done it that it was a game that was too difficult? Like, I'd always wondered why people don't talk about it so much or stuff. People maybe mention King's Quest 4 or 1 or 2 a lot more, and whether it was too hard for people or maybe, well, yeah, I don't know. Did you have a sense after it was done, I guess, of how well it went, or were you just on to the next thing and thinking about
I was
that?
on to the next thing, but I believe over the years, I've heard fewer people say that they completed that game than any other. I mean, usually when I talk with somebody about a game, my first question is always, "Well, did you finish it?" Because a lot of games back then they were too difficult to finish. And King's Quest 3, the majority of people I've talked to said, I tried.
It had a
So,
very, very long sort of first act too, because then there's the pirate
yes, it
ship
did.
and the race home, but that all sort of just happens like that once you've done part one,
Yeah.
which is massive. Cool. Okay, I don't want to hold you too much longer, but maybe a little bit. I sort of wanted to get on to maybe some other random topics, like you're a saxophonist. You played music since I guess you were quite young, 13 or something. I don't know if I'm making that up,
Well, I
but
started playing professionally when I was 13. I got
all
paid
right.
when I was. I
Well,
started long before that.
right. And do you play a lot of other instruments apart from the saxophone?
Flute and clarinet, piano, and I can. Well, I was a band director, so I can teach you how to play trumpet or trombone or any band instrument, or string instrument for that matter. You just don't want to hear me solo on them. I don't
Right.
sound very. But if you need to know E natural on trombones in second position.
Well,
Well, I still know all that stuff. It's ingrained. You
yep.
can't forget it.
Yeah, I think music's like a beautiful medium in a way because it once you get okay at it, it's quite immediate. You make the sound and it happens, and if you're with other people playing, you're all making the sound and it's happening right now, which is quite different than computer games where you're like it's sort of a painstaking process in some ways. I guess I wanted to sort of ask you, being
Well,
some
let me comment on that before you go on.
go on, yeah.
Uh, the hardest thing about doing a comedy game is that things that I thought were funny, by the time I got the background artists to draw the backgrounds and I got the animators to animate what was needed in the scene and I got the programmers to program all that stuff, and then I had written it and tuned it and rewritten and edited and so forth over and over again, and then we went to Hollywood and we hired a voiceover actor to read the lines out loud and record it and put that in the game. By the time you get through all that stuff, nothing that I wrote seemed funny anymore. And it wasn't until the games actually shipped and went out, and I watched people play them or saw or heard from reviewers and so forth, that you would know whether or not they thought the joke was funny. I longed for like being a stand-up comic in a comedy club. That was like well, think of it. You tell a joke and you immediately know whether people liked it or not. And then the next night you can make it better or different or drop it.
Yeah,
With
yeah.
me, it was months and months and months. And finally, nothing's funny after you see it the 100th time. And then finally, it would go out and people would say, "Hey, that was funny." And you go, "Oh, good. I'm glad." But
Yeah,
anyway, go
yeah.
ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean that's sort of, yeah, what the sort of thing I'm interested in, where I think uh, I've I play music and stuff as well, but mainly focus on making computer games now, and I'm always wishing that that time between sort of inspiration and um, it actually happening could be as small as possible. Which I think things like the AGI engine or the SCI engine probably help that a lot. You could probably get a scene happening fairly, but like you say, like actually getting it to the player was still months and months in the
We
making.
uh, we also did something weird. If you want to get down the rabbit hole a little deeper, um, our games were developed with set um, variable space. We would set up certain areas in the system that we said, okay, these areas can be changed by any programmer, any scene, any number. But these others are reserved for local usage only. And
Okay,
and
like
so
global and local variables. So,
exactly.
yep.
And we also allowed the local scene to be compiled and run without compiling the entire game or merging it together and compiling. So I could make a change. I could be typing along and say, "Oh, I wonder if I could put a thing here and I could do this," and then I would literally hit um, Control S to save and then Alt Z to exit my editor. But the Alt Z only shelled out of the editor and into a DOS shell. And in that DOS shell, I could run a batch file that ran the game. It looked at a DOS parameter variable, one of the fixed variables in DOS that you could set. And I would set that to this room number that I was writing at that time. So I didn't even have to type the room number. I would type the name of the game, KQ3 or whatever, 27, and it would immediately run the game, set up just that room that I had been in working on. I could make the change. In the game, I assigned Alt Z to exit the game immediately without asking if you're really serious, and
Yeah.
be back. So I could do Control S, Alt Z, test, Alt Z back in the editor, Everything's back the way it was, and I could do a round trip in 5 seconds.
Right.
And it was amazingly productive. I mean, you could write a lot of code, a lot of text, a lot of do a lot of work very quickly because you never spent time compiling the game. It was just kind of automatically done and
Yeah,
done.
yeah. That's awesome. I love the fact that system as it developed, I guess as you add in that your test functions and everything, that it allowed yourself to make lots and lots of games. But like it's interesting at Sierra, I guess this royalty system or the way that they approached people having their own games seemed really fruitful, I guess, for like the Space Quest guys, or even I was looking up who did art on your early games, and I think one of the art guys was there from King's Quest and even before, but he ended up making Gold Rush and did all maybe the programming and scripting in that. Where
Doug McNeil.
yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's I think it's awesome that these tools let you pump out games and iterate like this more, I guess, like you're jamming them out, but with yourself, I suppose, or with a few other people. That's
Yeah.
cool. Now I did find a funny Easter egg that in the Black Cauldron, you can look through a wall and see an ad for King's Quest 3. Does that suggest that by the time Black Cauldron was being finished, King's Quest 3 was being made then?
It wasn't being made, but it was. We knew it was
Okay, it
coming.
was on the slate.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm sure. Actually, Roberta was working on it by then. I'm sure.
cool. I was just wondering about that. Thank you for talking to me about King's Quest 3. I know that that's not your baby. It's sort of more the Leisure Suit Larry games. And
Well, it was definitely my baby the year that I made it.
right.
I worked my ass off on that game. It was a real challenge to do, and I was very proud of it when it shipped. It was fairly bug free, and I was proud of it.
Well, as I said, it was definitely one of the many standout games for me. But maybe it was the particular age that I played it, but it really resonated, and it was really cool. But then you went on to do the Leisure Suit Larry games. We won't go into them in detail because I've already taken up your time, and there's probably more times you've chatted about them. But they're obviously very special to the audience and your own creation. And I think that you did sort of strike a perfect balance there between them being, saucy and tawdry, but they were very funny, and about Larry sort of being the butt of the jokes, and the women were sort of actually the smart, powerful sort of characters in the story.
Also, the story of my life.
Right. So yeah, thank you very much for those games. I've actually got a little. There's a non tonight Passionate Paddy in Pursuit of the Pulsating Pectorals manual printed out here. I was always very angry. I lent the manual to a guy at school and he never gave it back. So
Oh no!
I printed out a copy. But yeah, so these days, are you mostly sort of retired and doing your own thing, working on the allo.com website? What sort of things are you up to these days?
Well, I retired 22 years ago,
Nice.
so that's a while back. I've been working on hobbies and enjoying my grandchildren and so forth. I'm an old man now, and I was happy. I got into the game business not as early as I should have, but early enough that I still could have some success. And I got out a little bit late, I think.
You mean in terms of Sierra
Fortunately,
having troubled sort of just a messy end,
yeah,
or
yeah. Sierra's hardships at the end were massive. They were purchased by by some criminals, guys who ended up being convicted and going to federal penitentiary for 15 years here in the States. So when I say the company was stolen from Ken and Roberta by criminals, that's exactly the case. I can say that because they were convicted in court. But that's a whole other ugly story. But I stayed around for a while after that, and I wish that I hadn't, because it was hard to watch a company that Ken and Roberta had started on their kitchen table and grown to the point of $1 billion market capitalization in 20 years, and then to have it taken under false pretenses, stolen from them, and then worst of all, run into the ground. within 5 years, the company went from a 28% market share. In other words, 28 cents out of every dollar spent on software for home computers was a Sierra product. And in 5 years, that went to almost nothing. They had 1,200 employees. In 5 years, they had 10, and they locked the doors and turned off the lights, and that was the end of a great company. So it was sad. I left, but maybe not quite early enough.
Mm.
Um,
It was sad
and
for everyone to sort of watch that happening too, and you often
yeah,
sort of see the pattern of these, you know, companies getting bought up, and you think, oh well, hopefully this goes well, but so often it seems to turn into some sold on to someone else and misunderstood and shut down, and it's like, why do they buy it in
the
the first place?
the worst. Well, let me say the second worst phrase I ever heard was, "We love the company and we're not going to change a thing." And if you ever hear anybody say that, what that means, translated into English, is we're going to change everything.
Yep.
And the worst phrase, though, was when I went into the office one day and they said, "We've discovered accounting irregularities." The stock was trading at $42 a share. And from that day forward, it went nothing but down until I think it was down to $8 a share. My stock options were 25, so or 22 $22. So I just watched all this money that I never had disappear and vanish. It was a sad time.
Mm. It was. I think I've heard you mention that Ken was responsible for one of the last sort of deals with publishing Half-Life and stuff. Um,
Yes,
I believe
yeah,
so. It was like you could see that
I
even
have.
at the end, he was doing all these things that were right
Oh
on the
yeah.
money. There were some great games from Dynamics and stuff as well, like Betrayal at Krondor was really good and stuff. But yeah, it was sad to see it all sort of fizzle away later on. But you got a lot of good years in there, so that's good.
I had a lot of fun doing it. I worked my ass off, and fortunately, things turned out well for me. I discovered a strange thing. Back then, people didn't understand that the software business was much more like the toy business. They thought video games were like accounting software or something mainframe software. And so when we'd have a good quarter, like the Christmas quarter, and sell a bunch of product, our stock price would go up. And then in the next few quarters, just we didn't sell like that. Oh, the stock would drop and drop. So
Right.
for about 5 years in a row, I kind of watched that and bought when it was down, sold when it was high,
Beautiful.
and next year bought more and ended up.
That's
I
nice.
got a nice house.
Yep.
It took me a while, but I finally figured it out.
That's good. Well, it's great to see that you're happy and doing cool things, and you can sort of spend the time doing the things you enjoy.
Yeah.
Do you spend a lot of time on Lowe.com? It sounds like you get a lot of comedy coming in. You're curating comedy and playing with jokes
Well,
and
I started 22 years ago when Sierra crashed. I started allo.com and I started a daily joke email. I would send out 2 jokes every weekday morning to a mailing list. And one of those jokes was clean. So after 22 years, now I do the same thing only on Twitter as well as email. And I've got tens of thousands of people who get a joke from me every day. And it's if you want 2 jokes every morning, go sign up on my website. It's called Cyber Joke 3000 because that name was untaken. and
nice.
and it's free service, and I just do it because I love jokes. And people send me jokes, I edit them, tighten them up, and send them back out each weekday morning. So if you want 2 free jokes every day, send me an email, or just you don't have to send me an email. Just sign up on the site, and it's all taken care of by the list. So.
Nice, and you can follow Al on Twitter as well, where the jokes will be
Yeah, I'm
coming
Al
hard and
Lowe.
fast there too.
Yeah,
Nice. Well, thanks a lot for talking today. That was
you're
awesome just to
welcome.
get some insights there and that. So
And this,
yeah,
you're going to edit all this down to 22 minutes?
the greatest hits, the best of.
All
All right, beautiful.
right. Take care.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
My pleasure.